Hello everyone and welcome to our sessions on digital heritage inspection and survey, which are kindly funded by Historic England. This is a programme of 10 sessions for learners of different experiences and backgrounds to find out more about how digital models and digital twins are being used in the heritage sector. There's a WhatsApp group where the learners can co-mentor and share resources too. My name is Linda Jubb and I'm your host today. I'm a Chartered Building Surveyor and Fellow of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Our practice, Jubb Clues, specialises in the survey and repair of historic buildings. Thanks everybody for coming. This is session 9 of our 10 sessions. We're now at the business end of the course. We're going to be talking about funding. So my guest today is Nicola Dyer, who is not only a great friend, she's also bit of an expert in heritage funding. Can I let you introduce yourself, Nicola?
Sure, thank you, Linda. So hi, I'm Nicola, currently freelance heritage project manager and consultant, but just come off a year with English Heritage as property curator for the South, and before that, project manager with the lovely Greenwood projects. So absolutely not a digital twin expert, but really interested, like I imagine most of you, in considering how it can be used within a project's context. And as Linda alluded to, lots of experience with Heritage Fund projects. Previously, many moons worked for them, and since then been a very lucky recipient with lots of projects of funding, which has really been the catalyst for making so much happen within the heritage sector.
That's brilliant, Nick. I'm going to come back and quiz you some more on your specialism in a moment. But just to frame what we're going to go through today, we're going to be looking into funding for digital twins, models, data capture. There's a little case study there on the right, which you can look up online, which is about Raby Castle, which got a grant from the Castle Studies Trust to carry out recording digital twin of the building. And it's a great example of how small grants can make a big difference, and also just right on point for the sort of things that we'll be talking about in the other sessions. I want for you at the end of this session to know about the key sources of funding for digital models here in the heritage sector. I want you to be able to identify grant schemes, if you need grant aid, what sort of things are available, understand something about the application process, and of course at some stage in choosing which grant scheme you go into and actually opening up your grant application, you will have to have some idea around budget. And I know that's a question that's come up in previous sessions as well. In terms of the key sources of funding, the most obvious one is the private sector. And what I've got here is a digital twin of the whole of Singapore, which I'm not going to run for you now. It's a 3-minute video. I'll share it in the WhatsApp group. This was partly funded by government. So there has been government grant aid put in to match with private sector funding. But the vast majority of what we do is economically viable in its own right. Building owners and commissioning clients put together a cost and benefits analysis. One of the costs might be that you need measured drawings anyway. So you think, well, hang on a minute, what are the extra benefits and the extra costs of pushing through to a digital twin? Building your use case, building your business case around that. And within the business, there will already be funding criteria as to things that are viable, what the life cycle of every investment should be. And in that case, you might find that you don't need a grant. These bigger infrastructure projects, which are to some extent viable in their own right, in the Singapore example, from private investors, they need the seed funding because of the scale of them and also to build up momentum. So there are good examples in the UK of the National Infrastructure Challenge. And again, I'll give you some pointers to those. But there is a great investment at the moment in the UK in our cyber infrastructure. So in terms of bringing in new viable ways of doing this, if it's not through the private sector, it may well be through grants. Grants are a form of subsidy. This is when your scheme isn't completely viable. this poll is just to ask who's using grant aid. So are your projects grant aided? It's just a yes or a no, but it might be most of the time, in which case click on that one. Yes, but you're mostly privately funded. No, and you're here because you think you might need it, and that's absolutely perfect. We want to help you with that. And finally, no, I can't believe that you can get a grant for this. And also, you're in the right place today. So I can see that about a third of people here are using them all the time. About a third of people aren't using them but do want to use them. And there's people at the fringes there that are not claiming grants because they're privately funded, or that they've never used grant aid. In terms of grants, I'm going to hand over to Nicola now because this is her area of expertise, and in particular, she can take you through the biggest grant aid provider in our sector. I'm going to hand over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Linda. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Really important to state other funders are available, but the reason that the lottery gets spoken about so much, there's a couple of reasons. One, they're a huge funder of the sector, but also in terms of the processes and the support they offer, it's really, really comprehensive. And as a general rule, if you're satisfying Heritage Fund requirements and producing project processes and documentation to their standards, probably you're either going to be able to use those with a lot of other funders or extrapolate them. So they tend to be kind of at the top of the tree on those bases. They do a huge variety and sizes of grants, as you can see, ranging from 3,000 up to 5 million, indeed plus in exceptional cases. So it's a real huge variety. And currently they're just into a new strategic plan, and these are the investment principles. All of this is available on their extremely comprehensive website. So as you can see, there is one quadrant which is saving heritage, but Heritage Fund have always been one of those funders where they're also looking for social outcomes and sort of intangible benefits, as well as physical work to the tangible heritage. It's all about other aims and ambitions as well to do with social outcomes or the wider environment. So as you can see at the moment, we've got protecting the environment, organisational sustainability, and inclusion, access and participation, which in various guises has always appeared in their strategic plans. In terms of what projects they fund, we have sort of core heritage here, historic buildings and monuments, as you'd expect, museum, libraries and archives, designed landscapes, parks and gardens. But also what Heritage Fund are known for is that intangible heritage, so the heritage you can't touch, whether that's sort of community heritage, traditions, legacies, etc. So an extremely diverse funder, and it's worth taking a look at their case studies so you can get a good handle on what kinds of things they are currently funding. With the outcomes, again, you can see heritage is in there. So under other outcomes, you have heritage will be in better condition, heritage will be identified and better explained, and people will have learnt about heritage. So heritage is key, but within those as well, it used to be, people often say, 20 odd years ago, you could go to Heritage Fund and ask for a grant for the roof. It's not that kind of funder anymore. If you do have capital works, you'd have to surround that with a wider programme that included activity that was going to meet the priority outcomes. So in other words, inclusion, that idea of introducing new audiences to heritage. The local economy will be boosted, so that regeneration aspect to the projects that they support. Well-being, which is one of those fantastic ones that's forced heritage projects to be really, really creative in terms of how they're going to improve well-being, and there's been some really innovative work there. Improving the local area, so obviously that's the physical improvements that could come from capital works, but also just the kind of the lifting of the local environment and aspirations. Skills, so generally heritage skills, that could be to do with craft skills, archive skills, etc. But that's quite widely interpreted as well. And organisational resilience, which obviously is a huge one, particularly post-COVID, that making a project as sustainable as possible. The idea being, of course, that it's not reliant on future grant income in order to be sustainable going forwards. So in terms of what the money can be spent of, I mean, obviously we talked about repairs and conservation, and all the professional fees that are involved in that and the contractors' costs. We talked about activities as well. So in order to meet those wider outcomes about well-being, skills, inclusion, etc., and those activities can be hugely varied, from sort of the traditional opening up and sort of perhaps heritage that hasn't previously been open, having that physical access, but increasingly about digital access as well. So often projects, for example, generate a huge amount of original research, for example, oral histories or new explorations of archives by volunteers, and it's making sure that those outputs are available digitally. But it's its most basic. It could be the creation of a website or the enhancement of a website, but also about creating archives of those projects so that there is a legacy, which is another big word for Heritage Fund, is the idea of legacy. You know, what happens next?
We're going to talk about historic England, but it's interesting that you've sort of framed up what all those key deliverables are, and also a little bit in terms of process, because there is a testing, isn't there, all the way through, Nick, where when you apply for a grant is please tie it to your outcomes, please tell us what the money is for. So from that point of view, not every grant scheme is appropriate, is it? It might be that these projects just don't fit with the funding criteria.
No, and I think that's such an important point, because obviously when you're looking at any kind of funding, you're considering your funders' outcomes. So what is that? So in the case of Heritage Fund, we've looked at a summary of those outcomes. But of course, the idea is, you know, that normally there's kind of a bit of kind of looking at your project through the eyes of your funder and seeing if it's appropriate and if you can meet their outcomes, but at the same time really not compromising on the vision for a particular project in order to fit it to a particular funder. So you know, and that, back to that thing about Heritage Fund are a major funder, but they are not the owner funder. Just quickly before we move on to Historic England, I think the other reason to kind of open with Heritage Fund before moving on to other, you know, equally important funders is that Heritage Fund brings with it its own particular process and timescale, and that, because it's quite rigid in terms of, well, are you going over a certain amount? Are you into the two-stage process, single stage? And because their committee meetings at which they make decisions are at fixed points, and because they have actually a really helpful and clearly spelt out process, it's sometimes, if you think you might be looking at heritage funding for a project, it's worth starting by looking at that, even if you don't ultimately progress it, because by understanding their parameters and sort of building around that, if indeed you choose to take it forward, it means you minimise the risk of going ahead with a fabulous project plan and then later down the line finding out, oh, actually, it doesn't quite meet Heritage Fund parameters. So sometimes worth considering at an early stage, even if it's for processes of elimination.
Yes, yes. And I think the other thing that Eleanor Hazelhurst is here, she'll also add to that, something that we've learned along the way is that all feedback is good feedback. So just because you've entered into a process and you've not been successful, what they will have given you is amazing support. And I think that's what our sector is really good at, is giving each other, if they turn out to be not the right funder for you, they will definitely signpost you. They'll tell you how to improve your bid and where to get more support. I'm going to talk briefly about Historic England grants, partly because we have to at this point acknowledge our Historic England grant for this project, which really provokes the most interesting conversation. The grants, I've given you the web address for Historic England's grant page and encourage you to go and have a look at it. There are a few of them that I can showcase for you with case studies, repair grants, the management agreements for field monuments and partnership schemes in conservation areas. We've already touched on some of these case studies in previous sections. Some of these grants are more appropriate than others. for digital twins and models. So for instance, if we look for a minute at the Heritage Protection Commissions, this one number 2 on the list here, this is specifically for research and understanding surveys of heritage. I don't know the extent to which they've invested in digital twins yet through that grant scheme. I haven't done it, and so I'm very interested if anybody here has had a grant of that type. Some of them are less appropriate. I mean, acquisition grants, it's obvious what those are for. We do sometimes use grants for urgent works notices, but the recording element of that is very seldom eligible. There's quite a narrow band of eligibility in there. This is straight from Historic England's webpage. So they're very clear about who the grants are for. People who own or manage individual sites and need to repair or understand them. Local authorities and organisations who want to encourage better understanding and management. So that sounds like quite a wide remit, but it's really important to know whether you are, in the target audience for the grant before you apply. The one we've got a fair bit of experience is the repair grants. So the repair grants support the Heritage at Risk programme that is managed by Historic England. And this has historically focused on grade 1, grade 2 star and scheduled monuments, the upper levels of the designations. So for people who are not heritage sector experts at the moment, those designations are to do with what protective scheme they come under. And the higher levels of designation, like grade 1 and grade 2 star, are reflective of the overall significance of those heritage assets. So very few of the listed buildings are in those upper echelons, about 5% or something like that. The Heritage at Risk programme nationally is for the lower grades of listings. So for the local authorities are doing most of the heavy lifting on that, which is why you'll see in terms of the eligibility, these repair grants are available to local authorities, as well as building owners and people in those sort of distressing circumstances to help with heritage at risk, even if they're not directly cared for in the Historic England Heritage at Risk programme. Their Heritage at Risk programme also includes conservation areas. The grants are aimed at reducing risk or de-risking, and they're primarily for urgent repairs. So they are actually about interventions, but they can also be used for acquisition occasionally. But as you can see elsewhere, there's an acquisition grant scheme as well. The works that are carried out with these grants have to be sympathetic to the character of the area, if it's conservation area, or the significance of the building, if it's a listed building or a park or a monument. It's got to be based on a thorough understanding of the site, including investigation, and this is where your digital twin or your digital model is very likely to come in. It's got to be supported by proper project planning with adequate risk management and control. So again, this is part of the wider business case, is what is your strategy for dealing with the risk at this site. It's got to be to a good standard. So the specification is going to be important. And it's got to be, obviously, in terms of de-risking, it's also about trying to reduce the financial or the overall economic risk. So it's looking towards the viability, the future viability of the site. And of course, public enjoyment, just as you saw in Nicola's presentation about Heritage Lottery. We're only preserving these buildings because they're important to people. So being able to present them better to the public and to the audiences who really care about these buildings is obviously part of the desired outcomes of the grant. This is direct from the guidance, and again, the guidance notes, we can share those with you through the course materials. All the grant aided projects should be based on an adequate understanding of the property and adequately planned. So this is what's pointing you towards getting this kind of baseline data in your digital model or twin. And Later on in the guidance, it goes on, it is essential to keep records during the works and create an appropriate lasting record. So that might be the other reason why you might be carrying out this kind of geospatial survey work. The application process is very similar. Again, there's a form to fill in. There's lots of guidance to help you through the process. They will ask you certain key questions. Obviously, you need to know who you are to make sure you're in an eligible group. You need to know about the asset itself, where it is, how significant it is, a bit more about what's the business case underneath your project. Definitely need to know about costs, because although these grants can be in kind, because they'll give you a lot of support and signposting, it's mostly about making a financial contribution, and fees are an eligible component of that. They also need to know about risk and programme, partly because there are competing projects, and it might be that you're not eligible at the moment, but that they can see that you're coming. And I think that's really important as well. Is timing is everything, isn't it? And above all, that we understand the site properly, this assessment of the significance. In a previous session, we did go into our case study of the digital twin that we made for Tonedale Mill. That was using a repair grant from Historic England. And it helped us to, because we only had a very short window in which to carry out our survey work, and we knew that lots of the benefits of digital twin, such as being able to get measurable data, being able to avoid a lot of the physical risk of site inspections for people who needed to come and consult with us during the project, could be achieved through this means. That made it an eligible component of the grant claim. And it went on to gear in additional new funding from Levelling Up Fund, so that the overall viability of the site could be assessed. So it was a very eligible project. One of the other grant schemes that you have seen in that initial list is the Heritage Action Zones. There's a case study here. This is some work that was carried out by Christians who you've met in previous sessions for the HAS scheme in Bacup. The project partner there is Valley Heritage, which is a not-for-profit, a charity that's dedicated to Rossendale and the area to bring forward these projects. So they're a sort of informed client who's commissioning the work from the geospatial teams, and they're aided with grant aid that's distributed through the HAS scheme. One of the other case studies that we've shared with you was to do with the Countryside Stewardship Scheme, which is the higher scheme 2. So HS2, that sounds like it's to do with the railway. It's not, it's higher scheme 2 capital grants. Those were actually administered to some extent by Natural England, with advice and some funding from Historic England. And in the previous sessions, you'll have seen our case study, which Tom Martin brought forward, about how we built our own model for that, because the site was so overgrown and so difficult to survey. I wasn't getting any closer to it than that. Another grant scheme that we've had help from, and it wasn't financial help, this was in-kind support, was from the Heritage Digital. The Digital Skills for Heritage scheme has now been completed. It was a 2-year initiative that was launched in 2020, and it was intended to sort of expedite the adoption of digital skills into our sector. So they had a lot of support through Arts Marketing Association, which was about sharing the heritage and making sure that people were able to build digital assets for people to know about them through websites or visit them in a virtual way. And the Digital Skills Programme is the one where we got support. And in particular, we had some mentoring about this scheme. In the next section, we're going to talk about finding and applying for grants. And I may call upon Nick again to give me a hand with this, because the process of finding and applying for grants is bewildering if you've never done it before. This poll that I've just launched, I wanted to know bit more. Some of you said that you have been using grant aid in your projects, or that you were aware of it. I just wondered if you could let me know which of these funders or sources that you've been looking at. Nick just dealt with Heritage Lottery, which is the biggest absolute behemoth in our sector. Historic England, obviously, to some extent, you're all beneficiaries of that grant because you're in the course here. The Heritage Funding Directory is the one I'm going to come to, and I was just going to have a quick look and see if anybody's used that source, or indeed if you've used any of those other sources for funding for your digital models or your projects in general. Okay, so that bears out our feeling for the sector. Heritage Lottery is the behemoth, it's the one that people are working with. Historic England, quite obviously, and one or two people saying other grant schemes. Now, let's talk about that funding directory, because I was quite surprised actually that people hadn't heard of it. It's so important for us. It's hosted online, and I'll give you the web address. It's managed by Heritage Alliance and Architectural Heritage Fund, who again will be so helpful to you, if not with financial aid, with in-kind support, so that you can find out a bit more about funding and how to apply for it. One of the things that we had to talk about, Nick, we need to talk about match funding, don't we? Can you just explain in a nutshell for people who haven't had an experience what match funding is?
Yeah, so essentially, even the most generous funder, unless there are ones you know about, will tend not to fund 100% of something. And what you're more likely to come across is a real mixed bag of funding. For example, Heritage Fund, the highest intervention rate I've ever come across with the Heritage Fund, so in other words, the highest proportion of total project costs I've known, was a whopping 84%, which I think is fairly unusual, but quite often it's more around about 60%, which begs the question, where does the other 40% or 35% or 20% come from? And that's your match funding. Now, funders can stipulate, we will go up to this intervention rate and you have to find the rest. And what they're looking for really is commitment. So commitment across the board from other funders and investment in the outcomes your project's going to deliver. Now, match funding can be hard cash, which is always wonderful. You could, for example, get a funding picture that included majority Heritage Fund, some Historic England, and the whole miscellany of, if you go onto the Heritage Funding Directory, all those other funders who might want to support your work. But one of the most interesting ones to bear in mind as well is the concept of pro bono funding as well. In other words, some of your match funding can be made up out of a financial value, a nominal financial value put on your volunteer input. So, for example, if you are working with a smaller charitable trust or volunteer-led organisation, putting that value, for example, on their trustees' input into their project board, or if you're fortunate enough to be able to get professional services on a pro bono basis in your very early development stages. So Heritage Fund in particular are really good at recognising and valuing that has a real benefit to the project, but also it is a real sign of investment. It's not investment of hard cash, but it's an investment of passion and time and energy, and they do recognise that. So that the idea of pro bono is a really important one to think of in terms of match funding as well.
Pro bono is not dog food. It's Latin.
Terrible.
I know, the old joke's the best. But it's really significant because, we've worked in some very hard up projects and areas where even scratching together the very smallest amount of match funding, some of our really targeted grants have gone up to 95%, and finding the 5% match funding has been too much for the applicant, and therefore the most eligible, most needful organisations haven't even been able to apply. But if you can put it together through volunteer action, and you keep that as your pro bono donation, that you can use as part of your match funding, that makes these grants actually hit exactly where they're intended for, which is people who don't have the cold hard cash to do the things that they need to do. And sometimes you can use for match funding different smaller grant schemes as well, can't you? So for something like Heritage Lottery, who might give you most of the money, you can then put together some of your cash, some of your volunteer time, and maybe some match funding from another source. And I'm just going to flick the slide on, because you'd be stunned. I mean, this is just some of the organisations that are in this funding directory. I really urge you to go and have a look at it. There are all sorts of very generous funders who are prepared to help you with different things. And as you can see, some of them are strictly for in-kind type contributions, such as the SPAB technical advice line. Not everything is about cold hard cash. Sometimes you can make a big difference just by getting new ideas and volunteers involved. Some of them have got obvious territorial limits, such as Scottish grant makers, and some of them are towards certain building types, such as all churches or war memorials. But the ones that are really cherished in our sector are the ones like, I think we mentioned while we were chatting before, Garfield Weston. There are some that will help, not just with capital projects, but revenue, which is very hard to come by, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think one of the other things to bear in mind about funders as well is that a lot of these funders are quite, they will understand they're part of an overall funding picture as well, particularly if it's a major project. Then there'll be an appreciation that there's an overall funding picture to which all of these are playing a part. So I think with those trusts and foundations that specialise in heritage, they can be really helpful sources of advice in and of themselves. We've already mentioned the fact that Heritage Fund offer a pre-application service and are able to give you really, really high quality advice. And that applies to lots of these other funders as well, who will know they're part of an overall picture. They may have a particular angle or aspect that they're particularly keen to see as one of their outcomes, but they do understand. Because the ultimate nightmare would be, wouldn't it, if you had 20 different reporting structures and you were like turning around to each of the different funders and putting a different hat on and presenting a totally different face to them, when in reality they're sensible. Once they've bought into your project and they want to see your outcomes, it's good to build up a really good relationship with them, an open and an honest and a trusting relationship, and that's the best way you're going to get most out of your funders.
Excellent. Yeah, I thought about that, making sure that their objectives are aligned to each other as well as to you. Sorry, I may have name checked Garfield Weston by mistake when I was actually thinking of Esme Fairbairn. There's that name there on this list. One of our objectives in this project is to think about areas for research in future. And I wondered whether it might be worth one or a small group of us setting about having a look at these and seeing whether there is any, which are the most viable of these. Is there any funding for the preparation and the archiving of digital models? Because I don't think, from my experience, there's anything particularly dedicated towards that, but it might be something that we can work towards as a piece of research at the end of this project. Within there, you'll see lots of smaller grant bodies, and I thought for a minute I'd talk about National Churches Trust, because they're so typical, in terms of their scale of grants. They're well known in the sector. They're only dealing with a certain building type, obviously, places of worship. But you'll see this across a lot of them. They have funding partners. They've got territorial funds. These one over here for Ireland. They've got this one here for Scotland, Wales and Northwest England. But then also they've got their grants sifted by scale, large grants, medium and small. And those small grants, I'm really hoping that at some point Eleanor will dive in and tell us a bit more about the process of being fit for funding. Being able to start with a smaller grant so that you can get experience of using grant aid, and then moving on to do more ambitious schemes is a really good approach, because there's so much to learn along the way about using grant aid and building your own sort of reporting structures and your treasury function and so on towards doing that kind of work. So inevitably now we're going to have to talk about budgeting. Budgeting isn't in a project necessarily the first thing you'll do, but in terms of applying for a grant, you almost don't know which of those funding streams you're going to go into without knowing roughly what is your budget. And there are various means that you could use to work out how much money you would need. I'm going to talk in the next session about soft market testing, talking to providers, trying to gauge how big your budget needs to be. And they will ask you obvious questions, how big is it? What level of detail are you going to need? How accurate is this going to be? What are your outputs? And also, when do you want it? They might ask you, what is your budget? What did you think you were going to spend? And that's not a terrible way of working it out, because very often clients come to us and they say, I've got a budget of blah, blah, blah. And straight away, we'll be able to say to them, well, the only thing you can afford with a small budget like that would be something like this. So then it just saves a lot of time. But also we can tell them then what the gap is between what they can currently afford with that budget and what the next step will be. And remember, with the match funding, it might be that they use the funding they've got for the match funding, but that they can see a really good business case for going that extra step and applying for grant aid. I'm interested to know whether the people who hadn't previously applied for grant aid, whether you've got enough out of today's session that you feel as though you might be able to in future. Mark, you're currently working in a slightly different sector, aren't you?
Yeah, I work in housing association sector, not in heritage, but I'm doing a master's in conservation and heritage and looking to move into it. But I'm volunteering on a couple of projects, the Town Wells one in Clitheroe. So, I mean, it's probably something else I'll chat with the sort of the wider group about around secure, potentially, if there is any routes to secure. And it's quite helpful this has been quite a helpful session to sort of see. I can get on Google now and start having a run through the different sites, and I'm having a look through the little, even to see what is available. I know it's probably not going to be on the radar of sort of the National Heritage Lottery Fund, but some of the smaller ones, and I know the Architectural Fund, it'd be quite good for some professional advice, maybe.
Yes, and I think also in terms of working out the budget for the Wells project, it's amazing that you've kind of built your own model already, because you kind of already know how robust that is, and how much you can achieve on your own, but also what weaknesses of having that kind of model are. If you have to go on and do an intervention, does that leave you with risks, and how would you address them?
It's sort of moving. It's figuring out. I've made a model, but what can I actually get out of it? What can I use it for going down the line, and what am I technically covered for? Could I, because I'm probably not insured to sort of use that to send to contractors and say, look, use this, or it's an interesting one.
Yeah, and also in terms of what to do with it in the end, because you've already said, where would I archive this?
Yes.
And one of the other areas of research might be whether we can build a very Heath Robinson, just a starter project, a pilot, a prototype for getting people to be able to put links, say, onto the comment section of the enhance the list.
Yeah.
A digital twin exists. This is roughly where you can find it on Sketchfab or wherever you've displayed it. Just even knowing that it exists and where to look for it would help people, I think. But there might be a better way we can do that. And I've got a chat. Lou, you're in the chat room. Come and tell us what you're thinking about the challenges of finding funders and the feasibility. Hello.
Firstly, thank you for sharing that link. I had no idea about it. I now have it saved, so that's absolutely brilliant. I've just been in a call, which is why I was a bit late to this, with a client who is just struggling with actually getting the money together to pay for all the extensive list of professional fees that are now required. And at the moment, I'm struggling to advise on actually how to even and that obviously ties in with digital heritage, because part of the inspection is in there, and it's a struggle actually. So I suppose I'm just sort of raising a question of how we advise and manage the fact that obviously a lot of these places just don't have much money to begin with. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the match funding concept is really critical to that, is how can you do a lot with a little? And it's a quite strategic decision is whether to throw your hand in, all of your resource as the lever to lever in more funding from somewhere else, or whether to just do a smaller project with the funding you've got and then wait for the next thing. I think this is a bit of sort of surveyor mentality, is I would tend to say get on with it, whatever you can do, get on with it. And wasting time is almost worse than wasting money, especially when you've got the buildings we work with are deteriorating really quickly, and they get, in terms of condition, to a tipping point where you've got no choice but to just record and start taking them down because they're just too unsafe to go any further. So that makes the digital twin a really good investment, because if you ever have to cross that bridge further on, you're already ready for that. But I do realise that it takes resources away from other stuff, such as even fundraising. That's a good thing to invest in if you've only got a very small amount of funding.
I think that's where the Heritage Fund, if a Heritage Fund route is being followed, and if the anticipated scale of a project is such that it's going to be a two-stage approach, so an initial development award to get up to sort of REBA 3, 4, and then the delivery application to then get you onto site and get the work done. And I think that's one of the really great things about that two-stage process in those cases, because it does accept, it doesn't change the fact that you need to do a certain amount of work to get up to the point of making the development application. But that two-stage approach acknowledges the fact that there is a huge amount of expenditure required to get up to planning listed building consent stage and to have to be at that stage, and that all of that is done with a level of risk. But it's all the time trying to bottom out that risk. So I do think that two-stage approach, obviously, that doesn't help with that early stage where it's like we've got a project, but we haven't got as far as preparing a development stage bid, and that very early project stage is always tricky. Obviously, there's the Architectural Heritage Fund with their funding schemes, which are designed for that early part. And then, of course, if Eleanor's staying quiet, I'll do the plug for Greenwood Projects Fit for Funding.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I think if there are any more questions, we'll take one more question. Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
It refers back to this Town Wells project, and it might be not the right sort of forum for the question, but there's two of the wells that aren't actually registered in title, so nobody owns them. So one of them is owned by the council, two of them have no ownership. How? And I believe I'm led to believe one of them is to unlocking any funding for it. What options are available in that instance? Is it a case of go down? You need to basically tackle the issue of ownership first before you can do anything.
That thing about the Architectural Heritage Fund early support, which as long as there is a prospect or a kind of, in principle, the ownership might be transferred.
That's interesting. No, that's quite interesting.
I also think here in Lancashire, Mark, we have a fund from I don't want to talk out of turn, but I think it might be from the Duchy.
Right.
So yeah, definitely want to take up.
Yeah, well,
in the right team here. There'll be people here who can help you. If we can't help you, we will signpost you. We will not let this go. Thanks so much. Take care now.